listening to Spellbound. Welcome to episode 21 of Spellbound. That's right, Spellbound is now officially legal drinking age, which is quite scary. Spellbound is now a CastBox original. You can still listen to it anywhere else you typically listen to podcasts, but check out CastBox today and see what's making it the fastest growing and highest rated podcast app for both iOS and Android. I'm joined today by Claire Lehmann. Thanks for joining us today, Claire.
Yeah, sure.
You are the founder and editor-in-chief of Quillette, which is an awesome publication. I love all the subject matter you guys tackle. It's so different, so unique, so special. Would you mind sharing your journey, which led you to start Quillette? You have such a fascinating story. I'd love people to hear it.
Well, I was a psychology graduate student back in 2015, and I became aware that what I knew to be the scientific consensus on a range of topics in the behavioural sciences weren't being reflected in the media, in Australian media or international media. And I just noticed that there was a gap where certain topics were not covered and not discussed. I think part of it is political correctness, but another part is just lack of knowledge, because most journalists don't train in the sciences, and particularly the behavioural sciences. So I just noticed that there was a gap. Certain topics were not being discussed for various reasons, and I saw an opportunity, so I grabbed it.
What kind of things were you seeing that were being misrepresented in the media?
Well, a topic that always kind of irked me and annoyed me was the way certain feminist issues were covered. So when discussing something like the gender pay gap, if you're trained in the social sciences and the behavioural sciences, you get it sort of drummed into you that a correlation is not causation, and any kind of social phenomena has many variables influencing it. You can't just be ascribed to one variable. So whenever I see conversations about gender disparities, for example, there's fewer women on corporate boards, and that is because of sexism, I get my hackles up, because as a trained social scientist, I know that it's never one variable. Sexism might be part of the equation, but there's going to be other things going on. And so it was this kind of simplistic presentation of these complex issues that was really irritating me. And I thought, well, it's time to do something about it. And I had a lot of academics and social scientists in my social network, and I asked them to contribute articles, and they did. And it's just gone from there.
Wow. So were those some of the original posts on Quillette?
One of the first ones we did, which was extremely popular, was an essay by Brian Batwell, who's at St. Louis University. He's a criminologist, and he's an expert in twin studies. He wrote an article about how we assume that children's personalities are shaped by their parents, but he was explaining the data that comes from twin studies, which shows that there's a much larger genetic component that we don't fully appreciate. The field of behavioural genetics is relatively new, and it hasn't had much exposure in the media, I guess you would say, but it does turn a lot of previous assumptions that we had about human nature on their head. And one of the things that behavioural geneticists have found is that the home environment that we grow up in actually has much less of an impact on the traits we develop as adults than we previously thought. And the influences that seem to be most powerful are our genetics, but also our social circle growing up, our friends. Our friends seem to have more of an influence on us, on our personality development, than our parents, which is really counterintuitive and strange. Anyway, Brian wrote an article about this, and it just went viral. I mean, it was such a impactful essay, partly because it was really well written and partly because it's such a counterintuitive subject.
Yeah, and you never hear that side of the argument represented in arguments like this.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, and it could be wrong. I mean, he's not saying that all of the science is settled and we know everything about these issues. It's obviously highly contested and complicated, but these are some sides of the argument that never really get airplay.
It's never one variable, especially with something like sexism or the gender pay gap. And what I love about what you're saying is that it's not that it's not that, but it's a lot more than that, because the common the common response you hear when people are talking, when they're getting up in arms over sexism and patriarchy and all this stuff, is you hear people on one of either side of the coin. They're either saying men are evil or women are evil, or, you know, men are out to get women or women are out to get men. And you never hear I feel like you never hear people saying it's a bunch of different things and we have to address all of them or we're just going to kill each other.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, there's sexism and of course there is discriminatory treatment of women. But unless we also look at structural factors like access to childcare, flexible work arrangements for women who have babies, and until we take into account the fact that women might choose different things on average, that's a controversial statement to say that women choose different things, but the social science does suggest that women have, on average, more interest in people, working in caring professions, and more orientation towards things that give intrinsic rewards. So women tend to be less money hungry and status obsessed than men. And I personally think that's a good thing. And I don't think that if people are less status obsessed and money hungry, that somehow they should be thought of as inferior.
What do you think makes, I mean, I have my assumptions, but I guess I'd just like to hear from you since you're way more involved in this topic than I am.
Yeah.
What do you think makes statements like that controversial, that women are less status obsessed and money hungry and more nurturing and more communally focused and things like that? Why do people find that offensive?
I think perhaps because back in the 70s, when the second wave of feminism was getting going, I think there was a resistance to women even entering in the workplace at all because they were seen as naturally suited to the home. And I think arguments about women being more nurturing and not suited to the corporate world were made with the intention of keeping women out of the workforce. So I can understand why there was resistance back then to those kinds of arguments. But I think now, several decades later, we can have a more nuanced discussion and we can say, on the one hand, women should have all of the opportunities as men and discrimination is completely unacceptable. And we can acknowledge that women have achieved dominance and have achieved great things in all different kinds of fields, some which have been typically male dominated. But at the same time, we can also acknowledge that on average, women tend towards having interests that do not overlap 100% with men. And I think we can acknowledge that, and we shouldn't be so scared that acknowledging that is going to somehow cause a backlash where women are suddenly run out of their corporate jobs. That's not going to happen.
Everyone could benefit from remaining open-minded, as, like you said, we're attempting to have more nuanced discussions about really polarizing topics because of the amount of information we're exposed to today and the amount of, at the rate we can share that information. We're learning so much. Our species is getting so smart right now. I feel like knowledge is exploding. We've got to kind of tread lightly and respectfully of one another. But, you know, also it's funny to me because when I hear something like, you know, men are more money hungry and status obsessed, you said that a few minutes ago and it didn't even, it didn't even occur to me that that was mentioned until just now. But that's basically like a criticism of, not a negative criticism. I mean, it sounds like a negative criticism, but point being, it didn't offend me. When I heard that, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. That's something that we should keep in mind in this discussion. And I think that mentality produces positive conversation no matter where you find yourself.
It's really hard to have these conversations with people who have internalized these political ideas as part of their identity. So if you're criticizing or debating political ideas, it's like you're criticizing them as a person, and that's where a lot of discourse falls down. And you know, we just can't seem to dialogue or communicate. I think is when ideas are not separated out from moral components and identity components.
I wonder how much of that has to do with religion. Not that we're talking about religion, but I feel like religion and politics get kind of subconsciously tied together in a lot of people's minds, especially in places like America where, there's certain parts of the country that are super, super religious. And that part of the country is very different politically speaking, is a totally different political charge there than other places in the country. And I think the world at large too. So it's interesting to think about how religion might play into that to some extent. Have you found that at all?
Yeah, well, Australia is fairly secular, and in my everyday life, I don't come in contact with what you would call sort of conservative Christians or Orthodox religious people. But I have noticed that politics seems to be filling a bit of a void in some people's lives. Some people who are secular and perhaps atheists seem to be clinging on to politics as if it were a religion. I think once you get that sort of involved in political ideas, it can be very hard to have any kind of open-minded discussions because everything just becomes amplified to another level.
I think you're right. And actually, you're representing a side of the argument that I didn't even take into consideration, but and you're totally right about that. What I was getting at is more of these pockets of people that are so religious that their religion affects their political affiliation.
Yeah.
And especially with, I'm not going to name any names of religions specifically, but a lot of religions, when you look at what they're saying, they are quite misogynistic. And so you could see how it's not that crazy to think that religion could be fueling the fire to an extent.
Absolutely, yeah. And when you are talking to very religious people, you can't criticize the religion because criticizing the religion is like a personal attack on them.
Totally.
And I think it's the ability to decouple ideas from you as a person, which allows rational discourse to happen. And I'm not saying that people who do that are always rational and aren't biased. We're all biased to some degree, but you definitely notice with religious people that the bias becomes overwhelming, and sort of nuanced, rational discussions about ideas which are particular to that religion are just almost impossible.
So you were actually blacklisted in Australia for speaking out against feminism in this way, right?
I don't know if blacklisted is exactly the right word, but I had an experience where I was getting published in a local newspaper here, and I wrote a blog post that was critical of some of the work that they were publishing about women and feminism. And there were 2 articles published about how research into evolutionary biology needed to be stopped because it was harmful to women, and another article about how social scientists have always been biased against women and are still biased against women. And I found them to be extremely prejudiced. And I just wrote a blog post sort of pointing out their logical flaws and that kind of thing. And then I was informed that I wasn't going to be getting published ever again at that newspaper.
Yeah, I mean, that's the definition of censorship.
Yeah.
But it's crazy. I think some people hear the word censorship and they think like conspiracy theory, Illuminati kind of like stuff. But it's actually more like, these publications are all running on capitalism, and certain ideas are just not popular with the masses yet. And so those of us who have unconventional ideas are forced to these like dark corners of the web to like build our own followings. And, what's amazing is the internet has allowed us to do that. And a lot of us are creating these buzzworthy conversations. And you've done that yourself. And it's amazing what you've just taken the high road, and, you've just chosen to do this yourself. And now you've got this huge following, and it's awesome. It's awesome to see.
Yeah. No, I definitely think if an alternative is not complaining about stuff, it's just building your own club, building your own institution. And I sometimes look at a lot of the complaints about sexist industries or sexist spaces, and I think, well, what's stopping people from building their own? I mean, there's always a creative solution rather than a destructive solution.
So what are some of the challenges that you see with the current feminism discussion that's happening?
Well, a lot of it seems to be based on this idea that the West is an oppressive patriarchy. The first criticism I have about that idea is that patriarchy sort of needs to be defined, and it's never really defined very clearly. If you look at the top of society, people in positions of power are predominantly men. But if you look at the bottom of society, homeless people, people who commit suicide, people in jail, people in very lowly paid blue-collar jobs, predominantly those individuals are male as well. So my first criticism of sort of what you would call orthodox feminist discourse is that if we live in a patriarchy, it's a hollow patriarchy. So there are men at the top, but there are men at the bottom, and most women sort of sit in the middle, in the averages. That's not to say that women don't commit suicide and women are not homeless, but overwhelmingly the ratio is something like 4 men commit suicide to every 1 woman. So it's an overwhelmingly male condition to be at the bottom of society. The same goes when you look at prisons. So it's not that all men oppress all women. There are some very powerful men who control the capital and control power, but the majority of men don't share in that power and in that control. And so the resistance I have towards traditional or orthodox feminist discourse is that it seems to be a lot of professional middle-class women complaining about men as a class, whereas most men are not as well off and privileged as those professional middle-class feminists. I think feminism's first problem is that it collapses class into gender. And I don't think it explains society very well when you collapse class into gender, because it doesn't make sense that a professional woman, a professional white woman with a media platform feels oppressed by her garbage collector, for example.
That's a good